I can't take credit for breaking Metallica. What I can take credit for is being one of the first people to ever play Metallica on the radio in America. And the story in a nutshell is that the guy who started Megaforce Records, Metallica's first label, his name is John Zazula. He and I knew each other. I was a kid. I would go to a record store that he had in a flea market, and I would always buy import albums from him. And he was a guy that very much had his pulse on metal at the time. And when I would go to the store, he would always be saying, try this, buy this. And a lot of times I did. And then I started doing a metal radio show in New Jersey right out of high school. And I went to, when I started doing that show, John would then give me records without paying for them at the record store, because he knew that if I went and played them on my radio show, people would then come in his store and buy them. And no one else was playing that sort of music, whether it was Raven or Manowar or whatever. So one day he literally physically came to the radio station I was working at. I'd only been there a couple months. It was my first time on the radio. I was doing a weekend metal show, and he physically came there. And I was stunned to see him at the door. I was like, what are you doing here, man? And he's like, I got to come in. And remember, this is early 80s. I mean, it's not how radio is now, where it's automated and you can walk away and hit a computer and walk away for half an hour. You have to, I'm playing vinyl. This was before CDs. You have to physically queue up vinyl and be there for when the record ends and start the next record. You have to be pretty on it on live radio doing that. But that's how it was then. And I was like, Johnny, I got to really focus on what I'm doing, man. You can't be in here. What are you doing? He had a record under his arm, and he insisted that before he left, I play this record. I was like, just leave it here, man. I'll check it out, and I'll let you know. And he goes, no, I need to hear it on the radio. I need you to play it right now. And that was Metallica's Kill 'Em All. And he explained to me that he couldn't get anybody to even understand the band and give it a chance. He had to show the band that he could get something going. And he said, can you please just play this so I can say it was played on the radio? So I did. I played Jump in the Fire. And I didn't know. I'd say this all the time, Daniel. I would love to say to people, I heard the future, I didn't know what I heard. I never heard any music like that before. It was like way more extreme than anything I ever knew. And I was just like, John, I don't know what's going to happen with this band, man. That's crazy sounding, but good luck and whatever. And he took the record and he signed it to me. And he wrote, Ed, you were the first, John Z, and handed it back to me. I still have it.
That's awesome.
As he walked out, he said, if I can ever get this band to happen, and thus his label would happen because it was on his label, he said, I'm going to hire you as a thank you as my first employee. Yeah, go ahead. He leaves, flash forward a couple years, Metallica breaks, moves to Elektra. He gets an influx of money for the deal because he owned Metallica for management and label, so there was a big settlement. Metallica goes their own way. He calls me, good to his word, and hired me to work for Megaforce Records, and that's how I began my career in the label side. So Metallica was indirectly responsible for me working for a record label, and I played a role without them even knowing it of getting the ball rolling for them. And when Metallica went in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they invited people that they felt were important to their career, friends and family, to the event and to a party the night before. And I was lucky enough to have been invited. And they were asking people to come up on the stage and tell stories about their connection to Metallica at the party the night before. And they asked me to go up and tell a story. And I told the story I just told you in front of Metallica and their friends at this pre-Rock and Roll Hall of Fame party. And the guys at Metallica had no idea. Like, they didn't realize that had all happened. And they were like, wow, we didn't really ever realize and put that together. Because Metallica has a lot of really strong roots in New Jersey because of Johnny, because he was based there. And I actually saw the last show Dave Mustaine played with Metallica and the first with Kirk Hammett because they both happened close to my house.
Kill 'Em All is Metallica's debut studio record. It was recorded from May 10th, 27th, 1983 in Rochester, New York, and was released on July 25th, 1983 by Megaforce Records. Megaforce is an independent record label which was founded by Johnny Zazula and his wife Marcia Zazula in 1982. As a matter of fact, John and Marcia Zazula founded Megaforce Records specifically in order to publish Metallica. In the early years, record labels were not very interested in Metallica. John Zazula, however, saw something in the band. On July 6, 1982, Metallica recorded their now famous demo tape called No Life Till Leather, which helped create a buzz for Metallica in the underground tape trading scene. No Life Till Leather features 7 songs, all of which would be re-recorded for Kill 'Em All: Hit the Lights, The Mechanics, Motor Breath, Seek and Destroy, Metal Militia, Jump in the Fire, and Phantom Lord. In the early 80s, John Zazula was a record store owner in New Jersey who also promoted metal bands on the US East Coast. He was introduced to Metallica via a 10-song cassette tape which featured live performances of the 7 songs on Metallica's No Life Till Leather demo, as well as 3 other songs. Music journalist Mick Wall states the following: "At the time he heard his first Metallica recordings, a 10-track bootleg cassette of one of Ron McGovney's last shows at the Mobway Gardens in November, Johnny was then running a record and tape stall named Rock and Roll Heaven in a flea market near his and Marsha's home in Old Bridge, New Jersey. Offered a copy of the cassette by a regular customer who insisted he play it immediately. The Mobway tape consisted of live versions of the 7-track No Life Till Leather demo, plus the newer No Remorse and Whiplash, and the inevitable Diamond Head cover Am I Evil? I was blown away. I wanted to find out where I could find these guys. They seemed like America's antidote to the new wave of British heavy metal. After getting in touch with Metallica via telephone, the only concrete proposal Johnny had for them at that point was the suggestion they might like to open up at some of the shows he and Marcia had recently begun promoting locally, featuring the sorts of artists his regular customers at Rock and Roll Heaven were interested in seeing. John and Marcia were able to scrape together $1,500 to send to the band so they could hire a U-Haul truck and make the cross-country road trip from San Francisco to New Jersey. They showed up a week later, a bunch of drunken teenagers suddenly arriving on their doorstep. They come and land right on my front lawn. Basically, me penniless, them penniless, and we're going, how are we going to do this? The final cost for recording Kill 'Em All was approximately $15,000, which almost caused John Zazula to go bankrupt. That's how big of a risk he was willing to take on Metallica. Were it not for the Zazulas, Metallica may have not gotten to where they are today.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was the guy without a doubt. I mean, Johnny had his pulse on a lot of stuff. He was very much at the grass levels of the metal scene. He had his pulse on what was going on in Europe. He fought like hell for Metallica to get that going. The stuff that he did get involved with, man, when he got involved with it, he was all in. Like if he was on Metallica at that time, it's all about Metallica. I mean, for me, Metallica, by the time I started working for him, Metallica had left. So all I did with Metallica was the first ever CD reissues of Kill 'Em All, Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning. The initial versions of those on CD I put together. I actually have a credit on them if you have the Megaforce versions of them. But the band and their business was gone from Megaforce at that time. They had already moved on to Elektra and to Q Prime Management. So when I came in, I was working on a lot of different things. And Johnny at that time, he was consumed with Anthrax, because that was the band after Metallica had left him that was of that genre.
How did you hear about Cliff Burton's passing?
At that time, I certainly liked and appreciated and respected Metallica, but I was still trying to figure them out, sort of, because it was so much more extreme than the music I listened to. And again, you got to keep that in the place and time. Back in the early 80s, nobody heard anything like Metallica. Now Metallica's mainstream commercially successful band. Back then, they were this underground metal thing. Nobody heard anybody play that fast or what the hell they were doing. So I really didn't completely process Metallica until, more into Master of Puppets, and in that zone is where I really started to kind of understand what they were doing, and my ear warmed up to liking them. Of course, now I love them. So I didn't know Cliff, and I didn't have a lot of any real experiences with him that I can recall. But I did learn of his death because I was working at Megaforce which when I say working for that record label, we were at the time were working out of Johnny's house. I mean, it was a shoestring operation. We were working out of his garage. And I just remember being in my space, because I didn't even have an office, in my space in the garage, and the phone ringing, and because John sat right next to me, and I just remember the look on his face and him tearing, and I just didn't know what happened. And I thought maybe one of his family members died or something. It was that kind of heaviness. It turned out that he had gotten the call from Europe about the accident, and that Cliff was gone, because I believe Anthrax was on tour with them at that time, although not in the same vehicle. John managed Anthrax, so they would have called and said, hey, or somebody from the tour called, even though Johnny was not working with Metallica anymore on any level. There was obviously a huge history there. And he was, and then went right through the house. I mean, his wife and everybody just devastated and crying like they lost a family member, which they felt like they did.
The John Eddie is referring to is John Zazula. John Zazula is the founder of Megaforce Records and the man who signed Metallica to their first ever record deal. Megaforce Records released Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning. Metallica eventually switched over to Elektra Records, who released the band's third record, Master of Puppets. Master of Puppets was released on March 3rd, 1986. The promotional tour for Master of Puppets was called the Damage Inc. Tour, Damage Inc. being the title of the final track on the original pressings of Master of Puppets. The Damage Inc. Tour began in March of 1986 and took place across the United States and Europe. During one of the European legs of the tour, that's when the tragedy took place. On September 26, 1986, Metallica played what would be their final concert with Cliff Burton. The concert took place in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. After the show, Metallica began to make their way via bus over to Denmark, where they had a performance planned in Copenhagen for the 27th. Throughout the European leg of the Damage Inc. tour, Metallica had complained that the sleeping cubicles on their tour bus were uncomfortable and not very good. As a way to decide who got to sleep in which bunk, Kirk Hammett and Cliff Burton would draw cards. On the night of September 26, 1986, Cliff Burton won his draw against Kirk Hammett. As the story goes, Cliff Burton looked at Kirk Hammett and said, "I want your bunk." Kirk Hammett replied, "Fine, take my bunk. I'll sleep in the front. It's probably better there anyways." Cliff Burton was asleep shortly before 7 a.m. on September 27th when, according to the bus driver, the bus skid off the road and flipped over. Cliff Burton was thrown through the window of the bus, which fell on top of him. The incident took place southbound on the E4 highway in Sweden near the town of Ljungby. I'm going to read you a passage from Mick Wall's Metallica biography, Enter Night, which I think paints a pretty detailed picture of some of the events which transpired. What is known, though, is that traveling south between junctions 82 and 83 of the E4 highway, they were about 2 miles north of Ljungby when it happened. The first James Hetfield knew of it was being wakened by hot coffee pouring over him from the upturned coffee machine. It was the yells and screams that snapped Kirk Hammett out of his sleep. Lars Ulrich's body reacted before his mind did. Sheer adrenaline propelling him through the nearest opening, the pain of a broken toe not even registering until he had stopped running down the road and begun limping back. James jumped free from the rear exit hatch and saw Cliff, his skinny white legs poking out from under the bus. James couldn't take in what he was seeing, the full horror of the scene yet to unfold in his mind. In the crash, Cliff had been thrown against the window, which shattered, leaving him half in, half out of the bus as it collapsed on its side, coming to rest on his head and upper body. James ran over, tried pulling Cliff free. No use. Cliff wasn't moving. That's when it began to sink in. Talking about it in Rolling Stone 7 years later, the shock was still palpable. "I saw him dead. It was really, really terrible." James recalls the driver saying the bus had hit black ice, then walking for miles in his underwear and socks, searching for black ice. But there was no black ice. At which point I, James, wanted to kill this guy. I was going to end him there. The second bus carrying the rest of the crew arrived on the scene just as the crane arrived to haul the bus back onto its wheels. Mick Hughes, Metallica's audio engineer, watched with horror as the crane put a big chain around the bus and began slowly hoisting it upright again. I don't know if Cliff was dead at this point or not because the bus actually slipped back. They lifted it to pull him out, and it slipped back and landed again on the floor. If Cliff hadn't been dead before, he was now. Detective Arne Peterson was reported in a local newspaper to have said the tracks at the accident site were exactly like ones she'd seen when drivers fall asleep at the wheel. However, the driver of the bus stated under oath that he had slept during the day and was fully rested. His testimony was confirmed by the driver of the second Metallica bus, which was carrying the band's crew and equipment. The driver was subsequently determined not to be at fault for the accident, and no charges were brought against him. Cliff Burton's death was an absolute tragedy and, understandably, affected Metallica emotionally for many years to come. Speaking in 2009, Kirk Hammett had the following to say. When I first joined the band, there was a huge infusion of new energy, and up until Cliff died, we were just so psyched about everything and life in general. But that kind of ended when Cliff left. I still think about him every day. Something he said, something he did, just something. I wasn't too angry in the beginning. I was obviously grieving, but the anger started settling in when I realized that it's not new that people in rock and roll die, but usually it's self-inflicted in terms of excessive drinking or drug abuse. He had nothing to do with it. It's so useless, completely useless. Kirk Hammett was close with Cliff Burton, as was Marcia Zazula. She had the following to say. If I had to say who was I closest to in those days, who did I bond with the most, it was Cliff. He was a treasure to have in my home. He was great. He was respectful. He was warm. He would help me out with Ricky because she was so little and I would be busy doing something. It would be time for her to go to bed, and so he'd read her a story or sing her a song. He was quite the human. James and Lars were just, diabolically different. Because at night, James and Dave Mustaine would want to go get drunk, party, and Lars, of course, would be out chasing women. Cliff, though, was really a hippie in a heavy metal band, with his bell-bottoms and his whole persona, just a beautiful, beautiful human being. He was a musician, pure. He was always respectful. We just sat and reminisced about the old days when they lived in our house and the things that had been done. That was just devastating beyond our wildest dreams that Cliff, of all of them, that warm, settled soul, should be the one who lost his life in that episode. Cliff Burton's death was a very difficult situation for everyone involved with Metallica. However, that didn't stop the band from picking up where they left off and moving forward. Something interesting which happened as a result of Cliff's death was the fact that James and Lars became close friends again. Up until that point, James and Lars had been growing somewhat distant from each other, to the point where there were even rumors that James wanted to get rid of Lars and find a new drummer for Metallica. After Cliff died, however, James and Lars became very close again. That wasn't all. Cliff's death threw all the remaining members' hopes for the future into sharp relief. It didn't just draw Lars and James closer together, it focused their minds like never before on what it was they really wanted out of Metallica. It had always been their band, their songs, but now they really did take control seriously for the first time since the days when there was just the two of them rehearsing in Ron McGovney's garage. Within just over a month's time, Metallica were already back on the road touring. Metallica's final show with Cliff Burton took place in Stockholm, Sweden on September 26, 1986, and their first show with Jason Newsted took place in Los Angeles, California on November 8, 1986. All in all, Cliff Burton's imprint on Metallica is very prominent, and Cliff Burton's memory has never faded from the rock and roll community. I went to a Metallica concert a few years ago, and at one point in time, they had a giant picture of Cliff Burton projected in the background of the stage. So Cliff Burton's presence is literally there at Metallica concerts even today. As the legend goes, once we got into the early 90s with Nirvana and grunge, all of a sudden there was like an overnight switch from hard rock, glam metal over to grunge. As someone who worked in the business, did you feel that switch?
Calling it a switch is pretty much exactly what you could say. It was overnight. It was abrupt. It was brutal. It was unforgiving, and it was instantaneous. So yes, it was as rough and brutal and abrupt as you could possibly ever paint it. I've worked in radio my whole life. I worked in radio during that decade as well. I mean, I literally had a program director come in one day when I'm playing whatever I was playing, whether it had been, mixing in Warrant with Led Zeppelin or mixing in Cinderella with Aerosmith back to back, no problem. This is what we're doing. To one day just coming in and pulling those CDs out of the wall, throwing them in a cardboard box, and putting another box in and saying, this is what we do now. I mean, it was just boom. It was just instantly overnight. That was branded uncool, unhip, and just done. And you were made fun of if you even ever liked it. And it wasn't just a washout of, here's a big part of that gets lost. So the bands took the brunt of it, obviously, those bands. But so did anyone aligned with those bands. Meaning that if you were a producer who had just produced 6 platinum records for, name the band, Winger, and all of a sudden you go and there's a record label and you're the 80s producer. We can't work with you. You couldn't possibly understand this. Like anyone who had an affiliation, if you were a photographer, if you were a record label A&R guy, signing those bands, suddenly it was a badge. You walked around proud of the fact that you signed White Lion, who sold 3 million copies, right? Well, overnight you went from being, let me get that off my resume, because that won't make me look cool in 1993. So it was across the board with the industry. It really was. And it hit the 70s acts to some degree too. Not as badly, but it did. It did.
Wow. And the thing with Nirvana is that they still have a huge presence on mainstream rock radio. At the turn of the new year, going from 2019 to 2020, I looked at the top 10 most played songs on mainstream rock radio for the 2010s. And 4 of the 10 songs were Nirvana songs, even after all these years. So why do you think that Nirvana has had such a longevity?
Well, I think they're looked at as the band that they're looked at as, I mean, it was a pretty quick burn, obviously, sadly with Kurt and all, but they're just looked at as, I think Guns N' Roses are sort of looked at as the band that gave the 80s the injection of life and in some degree an enema, and changed the tide a little bit, got a little more street, got a little more raw, got a little more real, if that's what you want to call it. I think Nirvana is looked at as the band that flushed that scene and was so immediately impactful that it just changed the tide for a decade. And I think when you have that much of an impact, that's just going to resonate for a really long period of time. And, the quality of the music, I mean, whether you like it or not is subjective, but for that genre of music, it's still really, really good. And it just made such a mark on people that it's just resonated like this. I mean, the one thing that I think is tremendously unfair, now that things have leveled off just a little bit, like in other words, now the 80s stuff has finally come around where it has a fighting chance. Those bands can at least go out and play clubs, most of them. Here in America, we just, because I'm assuming you're in Canada, right? Yeah. So here in America, we just got a TV commercial for an insurance company we have here called Geico, and they're putting Round and Round. The band is actually playing the song in their video. Previous to that, they used Europe, The Final Countdown. You're starting to see a lot of that 80s stuff become what it should be, a generation's classic rock. I'm 55. That's essentially my classic rock. So people are starting to realize that, and it's getting a seat at the table. But I think what's really unfair is classic rock radio in America, and I know you've done a film on this, What is Classic Rock? I mean, they, for whatever reason, for the most part, continue to ignore that stuff. And they went 70s and jumped right to 90s. So you're getting a lot of Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam in the mix now at classic rock, but you're getting very little of Rat, Slaughter, Winger, Warrant, White Lion, Cinderella. You're getting maybe a dabble of that, but really not all that much.
Why do you think the 80s got looked over like that to a large extent?
Because I think there's still a stigma against it. I still think there's a bias against it. I still think that the backlash to it was so unbelievably severe by the media at the time that there's still a little sort of like, it's still looked at as sort of like not as legitimate, which I don't agree with at all, but I think it's just looked at as like, it's why I personally hate the term hairband and hair metal. And I've talked about this a lot. That is a term that was put out in the 90s to marginalize these bands as being style over substance. In recent years, it's become like a badge of honor, and some of the fans even use the term because they think it's like, it just defines their music and they're proud of it. I always warn against it. I'm like, you're playing right into the narrative of why that stuff doesn't hold a seat at the table the way it should, because you're perpetuating the stereotype that it was all about hairspray and not about the quality of the music. So I think as long as people continue to marginalize it and call it hair metal, and people continue to just talk about the image versus what the records sounded like and the quality of the music, and there was some great music there, it's always going to be put into the sort of this box. And much of it is relegated to weekend specialty shows or, special, the hairspray hour or whatever, these radio stations have. And it's ridiculous because it should sit right next to anything from the 70s or the 90s. But there's still a stigma against it. There really is in a lot of circles.
Hey guys, so as mentioned, Nirvana had 4 songs among the top 10 most played songs on American rock radio over the past 10 years. As a matter of fact, every single one of the top 10 most played songs on American rock radio from 2010 to 2019 were all from the 90s. Lithium by Nirvana is the 10th most played song. It was released as a single in 1992. Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden is 9th. It was released as a single in 1994. Enter Sandman by Metallica is 8th. It was released as a single in 1991. In Bloom by Nirvana came in 7th. It was released as a single in 1992. Self-Esteem by The Offspring came in 6th. It was released as a single in 1994. Even Flow by Pearl Jam is 5th. It was released as a single in 1992. Plush by Stone Temple Pilots came in 4th. It was released as a single in 1993. Come As You Are by Nirvana came in 3rd. It was released as a single in 1992. Man in the Box by Alice in Chains came in 2nd. It was released as a single in 1991. And the top spot went to Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana, which was also released as a single in 1991. So, in other words, every single song in the top 10 were released between 1991 and 94, the 3-year period when grunge was at its peak in mainstream popularity. And 8 of the top 10 most played songs on rock radio in the 2010s were grunge songs. So the popularity of grunge, and in particular the popularity of Nirvana amongst rock music fans, is alive and well. There's no question about that. The real question is, will grunge and rock and roll in general ever get back to the widespread mainstream popularity it once enjoyed? If you're interested in that subject, make sure to check out my documentary, Rock is Dead. The entire documentary is available for free on my channel. Essentially, the film explores the different reasons why people say that rock is dead, and it looks at where the music industry may be heading in the future. When Motley Crue announced that they were getting back together, there was a lot of mixed reactions within the music industry. You yourself, were you surprised when they got back together? Did you see it coming?
No. I honestly wasn't. That was one band that I thought would hold to their farewell because, I'm in touch with Nicky. I've known him for a while, and he's a friend, and we text from time to time, and we talk. And when they were ending that tour, he was very adamant about it ending for all the right reasons, not wanting to stay too long at the party, not, it still being the original band, wanting it to go out strong. So all the reasons why you would want a band to end, but I think the temptation that's out there for every band of the money, and look, let's be honest, sure these bands want to play again, I'm sure they got the itch to be creative again and go out and play, but 99% of the reason behind any reunion for any band is money. Nobody reunites because it means less money. It's a business, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I think when there's a big clump of money thrown on the table, and then the additional interest that they had from the movie, it was just it's too much of a carrot. It's too much of a opportunity to ignore, and But I was surprised. I was surprised they did it. That was the one band that I would, when people said every band gets back together, that was the one band that I said, no, I don't think it's going to happen with them. Mick's got health issues. I talked to Vince about it before it was announced. He was really content doing his own thing. Vince was playing clubs and theaters, but he was getting great money, and he was flying in on his own plane and leaving before at the end of the night and going back home. And he had it down. He was loving what he was doing. And but again, you dangle enough money, people are going to take it, and I don't blame them for doing so if the offer is enough. There's enough meat on the bone, so to speak, and clearly somebody hit them with their number. And here's the other thing, Daniel, that's happening, is that until this pandemic thing happened, we have had a ton of shows and touring in the last 4 or 5 years. Many would tell you, myself included, it's too much. The touring world has gotten completely oversaturated at every level because it's the only way bands make money on the road. So you're seeing shows where they're offering what they call dynamic pricing, meaning that you go to a concert and the guy sitting next to you may have paid $10 for that seat and you paid $300 for yours. Happens all the time because they're fluctuating prices just to fill the buildings. So you got all this craziness going on in the industry because there's a lot of bands that are on the road just too much, and there's only so much that the world can absorb. And I think what happens is, and especially when you look at the music festivals out there, so many of them are pulling from the same talent pool. They have to keep repeating the same bands. All the bills are starting to look and feel the same. My point in saying all this is that if you're a band that has been able to stay away for a while, whether due to dysfunction or you just broke up or somebody doesn't want to do it anymore, those bands to promoters have a real attractiveness to them, because they haven't been out there and people aren't sick of seeing them. All of these promoters are challenged to find something new and exciting to put at the top of their bill. So nothing makes a band's interest, demand, and guarantees go up higher than if you can sit it out. So that's why Rage Against the Machine was doing gargantuan business, because they hadn't been seen in years. Tool finally puts out a record and tours, selling out arenas with virtually no radio airplay because they were away for 13 years or whatever in terms of a record. My Chemical Romance, a band from my home state of New Jersey, I mean, they were a big band and they were doing well when they broke up, but not like this. They've come back and they're multi-night arena band. Even the Misfits, dormant for whatever, they come back, they're in arenas. They weren't an arena band before this. So absence makes the guarantees and the interest go way higher, and it also pulls a lot of interest. If you're Live Nation or AEG and you're trying to do a festival, you're looking for bands like that. Every day you're going to their booking agent saying, how much would it take? How much would it take? And every year you're throwing another couple million on that pile or whatever, to the point where everybody has their number and they're like, you know what, I got to go make this money. And Motley falls into that category too. They weren't out of the game that long. They were out of the game 4 or 5 years, but still 4 or 5 years of not seeing them. Movie comes out, gets interest. Live Nation says, hey, we want to do this thing. What's it going to take? Boom, there you go. So that's the big thing, man. I have friends of mine who are in these bands that aren't as active as they wish they would be. And I tell them all the time, I'm like, you know what? If you got the dough and you can lay low for 4 or 5 years, do it. Because when you come back, you're going to destroy. You're going to do really, really well. And that's exactly what's happening. People want to see the bands they're not sick of seeing.
Yeah, I mean, look at Guns N' Roses, one of the biggest tours, right?
If AC/DC starts up, which rumors were they were about to before this hit, that'll be gargantuan. System of a Down, I had their bass player on my show not too long ago, and he was Shavo, and he was like, oh man, I wish we should be doing more. We should be doing more. And I said, Shavo, when did you play in LA last? And he told me. I said, how many people showed up? He said, it was like 35,000. I said, no disrespect, but if you played LA 3 times a year, 35,000 people aren't showing up every time. It's just, if you space it out and you really create that demand and that mystique and make it special when you play. Now, I'm not saying most of this is not calculated by these bands. It's a byproduct of a dysfunction within them. But the payoff is that they usually will get much, much better guarantees. And there's this philosophy of less is more.
So, Eddie, what are your thoughts on the Kiss Unmasked era? Were you a fan?
I was a fan of everything that Kiss has done up until the current version, only because of the issue I have with the makeup and those guys having to portray the characters of Ace and Peter. And again, I've said this a million times. It's nothing to do with Tommy or Eric. Great people, great players. They're great at what they do. I have no ill will towards them doing it. It's just, as a fan, it's not for me. But outside of that, what I always say about my love of Kiss is it's basically from the year 2000 back. So when they did the first Farewell, and they said that was Farewell, that back. So that encompasses all the 90s and all the 80s. And I love a lot of the stuff in the 80s. I mean, I know every song on all those records, and I was super supportive of that era. Eric Carr was a dear friend of mine. I love Bruce. So I like a lot of that stuff, and I think it's kind of like when you look at Van Halen. It was a different generation's Kiss. Kiss fans have fans that have been fans of every single thing they've ever done, and then you've got a lot of Kiss fans that are just like 70s original only, and then there's people that are a little younger that to them their Kiss was what they saw on MTV in the 80s. So it's kind of like the same thing with Van Halen. People are like the Hagar era, the Roth era, and some people like both. I just had Sammy and Michael on my show. Sammy made a lot of news when he came on my show recently, because he said he always wanted to get something off his chest, because he always got blamed for the keyboards becoming more dominant in Van Halen when he was in the band. And he's like, I didn't want that. Because that was all Eddie. He said Eddie started that on 1984. That's where he wanted to take it. And then once he had a singer like Sammy Hagar who could sing anything, that's when he really took off doing that stuff. But that was coming from Eddie Van Halen, not Sammy, which a lot of people always sort of thought it was. But, going back to Kiss, I mean, the thing about Kiss in the 80s to me, Kiss in the 70s were innovators, where they were setting the bar for performance and marketing and merchandising and how to do things. In the 80s, and this is not only about Kiss, you could say this for a lot of 70s-based bands in the 80s, they became more followers. And what I mean by that is they were obviously influenced by what younger bands at that time were doing. And if you really look down the line, whether it's the way Kiss dressed or what their music sounded like or the producers they were using, it was very much following what was happening with, at that time, younger bands versus them paving their own way. Where in the 70s, they were completely doing something that was innovative and blazing a trail. In the 80s, they were looking at what was going on around them, whether it was Bon Jovi or Warrant or whoever, and being like, okay, we better start looking like that. We better start making our records sound like that. It was the Unmasked era. It wasn't, Ozzy did it, Aerosmith did it. Everybody tried to adapt, but they were looking at what was happening around them more than just saying, this is what we do and we're going to stay on our own path. But there was some great stuff from the 80s in Kiss. I mean, there's a lot of those records I like a lot.
I remember when we spoke back in 2016, you mentioned that once Kiss retires, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley intend on having an official Kiss tribute band to continue touring, etc. Do you know if that's still the plan?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They themselves have talked about that constantly. And I think the only reason why they laid off talking about that is because they themselves are back on tour now. So they're masterful marketers. The narrative is always going to be about where they want you focused at that time. And right now they want you focused on last tour, last time to come see them, end of the road, all that. That's where the focus is. But when they eventually do retire, that's when the thing will shift, I'm sure, to be like, okay, Kiss 2.0, here it is, we're behind it. But they don't want to send that out there now because it sends mixed messages about what they're doing. But I don't think that's, and that's something they themselves have talked about. I just think that they've backburnered it because they're right now doing something else.
Would Eric Singer and Tommy Thayer be part of Kiss 2.0? Or would that still be considered Kiss because they're official members now?
I don't know. I've seen interviews, and I'm only speculating on all this, as a fan and someone in the business, but I've seen interviews with those guys saying that they wouldn't want to be. I think Tommy said he wouldn't want to be. Or Eric said he'd have to think about it, and Tommy said he wouldn't want to be, or vice versa. But I've seen that question posed to those guys, and it's a valid question because you would think that they are that in the current version of the band, so why not just replace Gene and Paul and they could keep going? But I don't know. I don't know if that would be offered to them, and I don't know if it's something they'd want to do.
Hey guys, so for those of you who may not be familiar with Kiss, just a quick little breakdown. Kiss's original lineup consisted of Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, Ace Frehley, and Peter Criss, each of them having their own unique face paint and outfit. Since 2004, Kiss's lineup has consisted of Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, Tommy Thayer, and Eric Singer. Tommy Thayer is the lead guitarist, Eric Singer is the drummer. The controversy comes from the fact that Kiss has Tommy Thayer dress up as Ace Frehley and Eric Singer dress up as Peter Criss. If Kiss were to have an official tribute band, the tribute band in all likelihood would consist of musicians who are dressed as Paul, Gene, Ace, and Peter. But since Tommy Thayer and Eric Singer are already dressed as Ace and Peter, that's why some people are wondering if they would continue as part of an official Kiss tribute band. Eric Singer has been an official member of Kiss for 22 years, and Tommy Thayer has been an official member for 18 years. Both have appeared on multiple studio albums and have multiple writing credits, so they are certainly legitimate members of Kiss. Although they dressed a part of Ace and Peter, Tommy and Eric have made their own unique contributions to the band, and so if Tommy and Eric were to be part of an official Kiss tribute band, should that really be considered a tribute band, considering Tommy and Eric are official members of Kiss? It's an interesting topic for sure. A lot of people are very curious to see how this is going to play out down the road. So I wanted to ask you, we were discussing a little bit earlier right now about the younger bands and how hard that's going to be for them. Let's say, for example, someone like Kiss. Right now it's supposed to be their end-of-the-road tour, their farewell tour. Obviously, this is going to put a halt to that. Do you think Kiss would pick up that tour once this is done, or do you think this is going to just abruptly end things for them?
No, I don't. I think they will pick it up. I mean, their tour ended in America with, I think, 2 or 3 shows left before its scheduled end date. So there were about 3 shows they didn't play because of the virus that I know they've already announced they're going to make up maybe sometime next year. I don't know. I mean, they had stuff internationally as well. I don't know what they're going to do about that. The interesting thing when you use Kiss as an example is that's a band that has given a hard end date now to their career. They announced to fans a specific date next year that will be the final ever show they play, if you believe that. And so that's an interesting sort of deal, because if they decide to make everything up that's been postponed, that could end up going beyond what they thought their end date is. So I don't know if they move their end date or they cancel those shows and don't make them up. I mean, I think all options are on the table. And given, of course, everybody likes to, have some fun with Kiss, being that they're such business-minded people. But I think, given that this has been a pandemic that nobody could have accounted for, no matter what scenario they choose, I think it's more than understandable if they can the dates and stay with the hard end date, or if they say, you know what, we're going to just move the hard end date 6 months out because we want to make up these shows we didn't do. So again, I'm sure they're just trying to figure it out. I mean, as we speak right now, the big thing that everybody in America is waiting to hear about in the rock community is this tour of Def Leppard and Motley Crue that was called the Stadium Tour, going out, scheduled to start in Florida in mid-June. Now, we've seen major events and major festivals scheduled for July already canceled. The fact that this is not yet canceled is amazing to people, or at least been postponed. But I don't think personally there's any way in hell it happens as planned. I think at the very best case scenario, it's postponed. But that's the other sort of strange thing about all this as it's been happening, is how promoters, bands, agents are dealing with it. Because I know for a fact there have been events that were absolutely not being postponed or canceled, but they didn't announce them to the public until a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after they were already knew internally it wasn't going to happen. And nobody can quite figure out the reason for that, except for it might be having to do with, well, if it's postponed, they want to announce new dates at the same time. They want to still try to sell tickets until the last minute to then postpone it. I don't know. But there's been a lot of examples, very strange examples of that, where like even when you look at Kiss, their last show was the show they were supposed to play that got the first one to get canceled was in Tulsa. And the local news had footage of them leaving the night before, and the guitar player in David Lee Roth's band, the opening act, posted on Facebook the night before the gig that the tour was canceled. And they didn't announce that cancellation until like 4 hours before doors the next day. So you got the opening act saying the tour's over, we're going home. You got local news showing the band loading out the night before, but the public not being told until that afternoon. So strange stuff like that. I mean, and there's many other examples with festival level shows where there's been festivals that I've known were not going to happen, and they wait a week, 2 weeks more before they pull it. And I can only think it's just behind the scenes trying to figure out if there's insurance issues, how they're going to process refunds, a variety of different things at a business level that I'm sure play into that as well. So it's really hard. Everybody's just trying to figure it out and do the best they can. I think what Bon Jovi did very recently was a very, very class move, because he announced the cancellation of his tour with Bryan Adams in America. And he said he was announcing it this far out because he wanted Ticketmaster to be able to process refunds for everybody who wanted them, because he's like, right now people need income for food and survival and all that. He said, I want to make sure people get their money back. That's a big talking point on my show right now. And it's a big thing going on here, where with postponed shows, the option of a refund. And it's a very controversial thing, which I think is finally swaying to the right place, which is giving people that option to get their money back if they need it.
That's very nice of him. Do you know if they're going to reschedule the tour, Bon Jovi and Bryan Adams?
Well, I don't know if Bryan Adams will stay on it, but the tour is going to, I'm sure John will go back out at some point, but his thing was, I'm not going to string this out to the last minute. I know these shows aren't going to be able to happen. Let's get the money back to the people.
So do you think now that everyone's been off the grid because of this virus, it might actually be a major influx of concerts once we're back, because everyone's been gone, so to speak?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it's going to be a problem, Daniel, because what I think is you've got to look, nobody knows when shows are going to really start again, but let's use as an example, let's be wishful thinking and say October, right, of this year, we'll get some shows. So you're going to have the perfect storm, because you're going to have a bunch of shows that were already scheduled for now that have now been rescheduled for October, November, and bands that were not planning to be on the road now, but were already had dates October, November. So you're going to have, in a very compacted space, especially if you're in a major city, a ton of shows coming in. There was already a ton. Now it's just gotten double compacted in a way. And I don't know if the economy, a lot of people are going to come out of this, unfortunately, in a bad state financially. There's a lot of people restaurant workers, people that work in the service industry, they're really hurting right now. The last thing they're going to want to hear about is dropping a couple hundred to go to a concert when they're able to do it. That's one thought. And there's another thought where if you look at certain parts of this country right now, people are so crazy to go back out that it's just like throw caution to the wind, we're going out. I don't know. It's just nobody really knows, I don't think. I've had tons of artists on my show ever since this has started, and many of them just checking in and saying hello and connecting with fans, and many of them, concerned like everybody else, and all of them have differing opinions on how this is going to go and where this is going to go and when they might be able to get out on the road. I mean, it's incredibly hard for a lot of these guys because the road is where the money is, the road is where they make their living, and financially it's a big hit, especially bands that are at the club level, the smaller levels. I mean, those bands live tour to tour, and they really need the income. The band, I've said this many times, the Foo Fighters, AC/DC, Aerosmith, they're fine. Motley Crue, Def Leppard, the big bands, they're fine. They'll be okay. But the guys that are slugging it out in the clubs still, they really are struggling. And no matter what band it is, at whatever level they're at, the real people taking the hit here as well are the crews. There's a ton of people that make their living behind the scenes, and we're banking on tours and that pay per week income to make their nut and to be able to pay their bills. They're all on the back burner. The artists can, maybe some of them get some royalties still from recorded music. Maybe some of them are using the time, if they are okay financially, to make music. I know I just heard the band The Struts that I love. I just heard that all the guys in the band got tested to make sure that they didn't have the virus, and they're going to go into the studio and make their record. And the reason why they can do that safely is they were all able to get tests and know that that inner circle is okay to be around each other. So they're going to use the time to be creative and make music. Everybody's figuring it out as they go, but the people I really feel for in terms of the entertainment side of things are the smaller bands and the crews across the board. It's had a big effect and change on the way I do my radio show. I do a daily show live, normally on Sirius XM, and the biggest thing that happened for me, I had already been working from home for the most part. I have a home studio, and I do my show live from a home studio predominantly, but the big change happened in that I'm unable to do the show live. I usually do my radio show live every day, but that requires me to have a producer in the building and in the studio, and the producers and the studios are closed. So I'm having to pre-record the show every night and basically work without the benefit of having callers. So I don't really have a back and forth with my audience, which I love doing. It's more of me just working off of emails that come in, or just riffing on various things in the news or whatever it may be. So it's changed a little bit of the way that I do my show, actually, but I've been very lucky in that where a lot of people have totally lost their jobs and don't have the ability to work, I'm still able to work and still able to, for the most part, do what I've been doing. The other big thing is that I have several other radio programs, including a podcast and an FM radio show, and that's taken hits financially just because they work off of advertising, and the advertising revenue is way down right now. So I'm feeling it there. I'm feeling it in terms of appearances. I do a lot of travel. I do my show from all over the country. I host a bunch of different shows and concerts, many of which have been canceled. So it's had a pretty big hit on my business and the way I do things, but not nearly to the level, fortunately. And I feel for a lot of the people who have really struggled in terms of losing their jobs outright or have no ability to make money. Certainly not in that boat, but I have had to adapt and change, and certainly have taken some hits along the way.
If you guys like this video, make sure to subscribe for more. Everything on this channel is completely original. I'm the one doing all the videos and all the editing, so if you guys like what you see and you want to support me, the best way to do so is honestly just to subscribe. Thanks for watching.